is Linda McFarland. I'm the Deputy Executive Director at Detention International. I've been there since 2005. My background is as a clinical social worker. I started my career at a youth facility. I was a custody staff and then a unit supervisor. And then I said I was done with corrections, I'm out of here, I'm going to grad school. I went to grad school and I went back to the exact same unit as a therapist. So I wasn't clearly done. But then the other major part of my career has been in rape crisis in the community, working. I directed the counseling program at a rape crisis center in Long Beach, California, and I've worked at a couple rape crisis programs in Michigan, all doing the community response and working with law enforcement as well. So this work now, bringing the response and prevention and education around sexual abuse into the corrections environment, really combines my two passions and my two main areas of interest and expertise. So I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really glad to see you all looking somewhat awake yet. But we'll see what we can do about that.
Hi, and I'm Bob Dumont. I'm a licensed clinical mental health counselor, a diplomatic clinical forensic counseling. Been involved in criminal justice, mental health, and corrections since 1970. I served initially with the Massachusetts Department of Youth Services, managing a community-based treatment program after Dr. Jerome Miller had deinstitutionalized the juvenile institutions in the Commonwealth. In 1979, I served as the Director of Victim Witness Assistance with the Essex County District Attorney's Office. In that role, I had the opportunity to work with rape victims, battered women, children who were physically and sexually abused, and also became a certified rape investigator and a certified rape counselor. In the mid-1980s, I went to work with the Mass Department of Corrections, first as a psychologist, then as the Director of Mental Health, and finally as the Director of Research and Planning when I left the department in 2006. In addition, I've had a lot of experience with prisoner sexual violence. I've written extensively on the topic. I contributed language to the Prison Rape Elimination Act. I also testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee in 2002, and have had the pleasure of working both with JDI, Detention International, formerly known as Stop Prisoner Rape, but also work with the National Prison Rape and Elimination Commission, the National Institute of Corrections. And for the last couple of years, 2.5 years, I've been managing a mental health court out of the Merrimack County, New Hampshire 6th Circuit District Division in Concord. And this is my official first week with Detention International. I just left my position a few days ago, and I'm becoming now a senior program director with JDI. So it's a pleasure and honor to be here. I see some old friends, hopefully some new friends, and we hope to have a good opportunity to kind of share some of the challenges of PREA today.
Need to say we don't have any relevant financial relationships with any commercial interests here. And what we hope to do today is make sure that you all have a basic understanding of the scope, the intent of the PREA standards, and specifically how they relate to you. Also that we will go over kind of how to discuss the role of healthcare leadership, both in compliance with the PREA standards and best practices around prevention. And we will go somewhat into a basic understanding of trauma, which I'm sure you all have, but we're going to relate it specifically to why it's important and how it overlaps with the PREA standards. Detention International is a nonprofit health and human rights organization. We were founded in 1980 by survivors of sexual abuse in detention and have been working on this issue, solely this issue, since then. Our mission is to end sexual abuse in all forms of detention. As Bob mentioned, we've worked with partners in corrections and different allies in the field for many, many years, and we're involved with the crafting and the passage of the Prison Rape Elimination Act, and as well as with the form that the current standards that we have before us take. We do a variety of things. One of our main roles is that we provide direct support, mainly via mail, to survivors of sexual abuse who are currently incarcerated. We work with corrections departments to help them to implement the standards, and we provide training to allied professionals, corrections, rape crisis programs, mental health programs, and of course contractors who are working with corrections. This presentation is funded by the PREA Resource Center. Just Detention International, as well as NCCHC, are primary partners with the PREA Resource Center. So it's a national organization that was started by the Department of Justice in order to support corrections in the implementation of the standards. And there are a lot of really fabulous materials available there. Policy, documents, audit tools, webinars. If you want something for staff training, there's tons of archived webinars there. And it's also a place where you can directly ask questions about the standards. So if you're working with the facility that you work in to put some policies or practices into place and you have questions about either can we get some support in making this happen, they have technical assistance available. Or you can also just ask them a simple question. And if it's something that needs to be forwarded to the Department of Justice, they'll do that. And that's www.prearesourcecenter.org, very easy to remember. We'd like to set the stage by playing a video for you. This is a video, as I mentioned, Just Detention International was part of getting the standards to the place where they are. And one of the ways that we did that was to be a part of listening sessions, to testify at hearings regarding the standards and the need for them to be strong. And one of the things that we were consistently able to do, and the Department of Justice did show, I think, courage in allowing us to do this, was to always have actual survivors of sexual abuse in detention be a part of those conversations. What would have helped me? What would have made a difference? And so we have a survivor council, which is made up of individuals who were sexually abused while they were in prisons, jails, youth facilities, essentially, who speak, do training, have input into policy. And so most of the photos you'll see throughout this are photos of members of our Survivor Council. And this video is of 3 of them who, when we learned that the standards were going to be passed, that it was finally coming, and as Bob will go into this in a little more detail, the process that went to, we sat down with them and asked them, what does this mean to you? There's finally going to be national standards that everyone is going to have to follow. What does this mean to you? And this is what we came up with.
In 1998, I was in a Michigan prison, and I was working at the warehouse in for the men's prison. One of the corrections officers was creepy, for lack of a better word. Started asking a lot of questions about my personal life, my married life, my sex life with my husband. The first time the rape happened, I said no. I was told if I didn't participate, cooperate, I would get a major ticket. I knew when I was going home, and nothing was going to stop me from going home. So I made the decision I wasn't telling anyone about the rapes. He raped me several times a week for 7 months. I still never said anything. And it was almost like I expected it when I went to the warehouse every day that something was going to happen. And I knew I had to put up with it because I was going home.
As the husband of a prison rape survivor, I realized that it takes time. You know, she couldn't just come out and tell me in a week or 2 or 3. It had to be on her terms. It took a while, and some victims take longer. You can't put a timeline on it. Everybody handles it differently, and when she was ready, then she could talk about it, and that's what some people need is time.
In the year 2006, I was arrested for public drunkenness and ended up at LA County Jail. It was the first time ever being arrested, and I was terrified. I remember, this one incident where this cop made a comment. He said that we all walk like girls. And I said to the person next to me, oh, a man unsure of his masculinity. And obviously the cop heard, he rushed me, pinned me up against the wall, threatened me, said he was going to show me his masculinity. A few days later, that same man that threatened me actually came into my cell. And of course, he came in there and manhandled me, threw me on the ground, stripped me naked, assaulted me sexually. Total humiliation.
I was 12 years old when I first entered juvenile hall. I was sexually abused by fellow inmates. Staff members were aware of this abuse, and they turned their heads, and they didn't want anything to do with me or the abuse. I found myself cutting on my wrist, becoming suicidal, going into isolation, and that's where it all started for me, the downfall. That led to future destruction in my life. So I ended up in adult prisons being abused and being attacked, not only by fellow inmates, by staff members as well. So it really turned my life upside down. I really didn't know exactly what to do. And I needed guidance, and I was not getting that guidance from the staff members in charge of my care. This is an extraordinarily historic moment for me that the standards have been approved. Finally, we're able to eliminate prison rape behind bars once and for all.
Strong federal regulation to stop prisoner rape is needed so nobody else has to go through what I did.
As a survivor, with the PREA standards being passed, it's good to know that there's going to be a protocol in these kind of situations. With me, there was no forensic evidence taken, no DNA tests, nothing. And with these standards being finalized, it's going to be different.
Prisoners aren't bad people. They're people who made mistakes. Nobody deserves to be raped. It doesn't matter whether you're on the outside or if you are a prisoner. You still have rights. And rape was never meant to be a part of the sentence.
Under the PREA standards, the staff will be educated and hopefully learn how to treat the transgender community. They actually were more vulnerable than myself, and I saw that and witnessed that firsthand.
There are good staff members working in detention, and sometimes they don't know how to handle a sexual abuse issue or abusive colleagues. And now that the PREA standards have been approved, that will allow more training to help those staff members.
Now that the standards are in place, we need to make sure that they're implemented so that the jails and the prisons know how to deal with them. Be it the training, be it the education. And they're a fantastic tool, but only if they're used. I'm a survivor of prisoner rape. I'm also an advocate to stop prisoner rape. Everyone needs to realize it happens in detention, but we have the power to stop it. We have to stop it.
One of the things that we want to know, and some of this you already know, but I think it bears repeating. The Prison Rape Elimination Act was passed unanimously by Congress, and if you think of what's happening today, you can kind of think, my gosh, how could something so dramatic get such widespread support? But I want to share with you, when I testified before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee, the name of the bill was called the Prison Rape Reduction Act. Does anybody have a problem with that? A little bit of rape is okay? In its wisdom, the Congress recognized that we may never get to the elimination piece, but we certainly recognize that we have to set that as the bar and the standard that we expect of all correctional institutions. What we do in corrections is care, custody, control, safety, security, and rehabilitation. Rape is not part of the penalty. I mean, we actually hold people accountable for what they do. It is the deprivation of liberty, and that's really what we're looking at. Now, it's the first federal law to address sexual abuse in detention, and one of the things that it really did, just for the record, this was a law that actually had teeth behind it and also some money behind it. It actually provided a wide range of funding through the Bureau of Justice Assistance. It also provided for an extensive and very trustworthy data collection set through the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which we're going to be looking at over the time. So they're looking at yearly research on the prevalence, and also creations of national standards. Now, one of the things that some of you may be familiar with is that the national standards really began under the aegis of what was then called the National Prison Rape Elimination Commission. From 2004 through 2009, the National Prison Rape Elimination Commission held hearings nationwide. It also developed the first draft of the standards. Unfortunately, after they sunsetted, the standards were submitted to the U.S. Department of Justice, the Attorney General. It took 2 years and the initial promulgation, and then the standards have been finally now in place. They were recognized and released on May 17, 2012. Effective, as you know, August of 2013. They now become effective for all correctional agencies nationwide. And they really establish a comprehensive set of guidelines. And some people have said, well, you know, this seems to be an extraordinary burden on corrections. I want to submit to all of you. The standards, to some degree, set the bar for good corrections. I mean, nothing in the standards really is anything other than good corrections, and it creates an environment where we're now going to be able to understand and manage this problem more systematically. Now, one of the things that you can do in your specific roles is that you can really give input to agency policies and practices. How many of you have been in agencies where the agency policy has sort of been developed before you got involved, and now you're having the implementation of it? So I would encourage, I think anyone in corrections knows that sometimes the people at central office create things without consulting with the practitioners. So I really encourage all of you to take an active role in looking at your policies and really ensure that those policies and procedures are basically trauma-informed. One of the things that we want to involve in terms of the corrections, is this going to be a reporting culture? As I've mentioned to you, I started my career in 1970. I'm sad to report, when I started, people were referred to, this is someone's kid. And what that was code. Someone's kid was someone's sexual slave that they really, and everybody knew about it, but nobody talked about it. One of the things that we want to do, and one of the things that's really imperative for all of you in whatever roles that you have, is we want to create a reporting culture. If you report sexual abuse, if you're being sexually assaulted by another inmate, by another resident, or by a staff person, we're going to take it seriously, we are going to respond, and we're going to do whatever's necessary to keep you safe and protected. And really, finally, develop a plan and a set of plans to respond appropriately if the sexual abuse happens while you're incarcerated. And for all of you that are in mental health and medical care, we know many of the clients and participants that we serve, particularly women in corrections, have had past sexual exposure and sexual trauma. So one of the things that we know, if you've had past trauma, current trauma while you're incarcerated, particularly with someone that's supposed to be responsible for your care, like a staff person, is only going to exacerbate that trauma and what you've experienced. Now, what is the trauma-informed approach? It really looks at a philosophy, zero tolerance. As I mentioned to you, Congress said prison rape reduction was not good enough. One rape is too many, and if we allow it and we continue it, we give tacit approval to it. In addition, we have a policy and a set of procedures that are going to be systematic, that are going to be thorough, that are going to be comprehensive, and that we're going to try to address so that if in fact it does occur, we're going to respond appropriately. And finally, we're going to look at the practice of what we do. One of the things you're going to hear from Linda and myself, can you imagine if you've been sexually assaulted and you now are undergoing PAT searches at some future point? What is that going to do? That's going to exacerbate the already trauma experience that you've had. Again, how many of you have practices when an inmate is taken out of the facility, they're put in shackles and leg irons? If, for example, that's done after the victim has been imminently sexually assaulted, is that not going to exacerbate the trauma? So I think we need to kind of really consider some of those outcomes. There's really 4 sets of standards. And again, one of the beauties of this is that the Commission and then subsequently the Attorney General tried to look at, can we treat all correctional facilities the same? And the answer, of course, is no. So they created 4 sets of standards. One set of standards was for adult jails and prisons. One set of standards was for community lockups or police lockups, which is certainly, that would be the lowest level of standards. Another one is for community confinement facilities, and the last is juvenile facilities. And one of the things about juvenile facilities is that do juveniles have more specific kinds of needs as well as some legal requirements that differ? Absolutely, and we need to recognize that. The standards cover a broad range of issues, and I think if you look at the list, you can see that it's really something that's really meaningful. Number one, prevention planning, response planning, training and education, screening for the risk of sexual victimization and also for being sexually abusive, reporting requirements, an official response following a report, investigations, discipline, medical and mental health care, data collection and review and audits. So the standards are comprehensive, and it's caused some consternation among correctional authorities, but as I'm going to suggest, and I think as has been suggested, these standards will improve corrections overall. We're going to look at some of the overview of the PREA standards. Number one, Standard 115.2.335 deals with specialized training. It is a requirement, and here's a question that I would ask you all to consider. Just because all of us have licensure in our respective disciplines, either as physicians or nurses or mental health practitioners, we may not necessarily have had specific training on trauma or sexual assault. So one of the things that we're going to do, and the standards really require, is that all practitioners who practice in correctional environments now need to have specialized training in terms of trauma and sexual trauma and the response that's required. Again, evidence preservation, professional responses to survivors, and reporting. Again, one of the things, there are some keys, we're going to look at some of the specifics. In addition to not only reporting the sexual experience itself, there also is a requirement to manage retaliation and sexual harassment that we are going to be required to do. Regular staff include what? Well, we have individuals who are employed by the correctional agency itself. We have contractors who are employed under contract with the correctional agency. We have volunteers. Basically, this requirement is for any person who is employed either directly by the agency or collaterally under contract with the agency or in volunteering with the agency in this requirement. What are the definitions? And I think one of the things, the Congress really struggled with this because, as you know, every state law has its own definition, for example, of what rape or sexual assault is, and that creates some difficulty. So there had to be a common language. When we're talking about the sexual abuse of inmate by another inmate includes any of the following acts if the victim does not consent. Contact between the penis and the vulva, or the penis and the anus, contact between the mouth and penis, vulva, or anus, penetration, and intentional touching. Sexual abuse of an inmate by a staff member includes any of the following acts with or without consent. And I'll ask you to consider this. For those of you who have been in corrections for more than 20 years, just for the record, in 1995, there were only 18 states that had a law that said that sexual congress between a staff person and an inmate was basically a crime. What's wrong with that? If a person is under your supervision, you have power over that person and you can cause them extreme difficulty. And just for the record, the last state in the union to pass the law that criminalized sexual contact between a staff person and an inmate was the state of Vermont in 2007, and not because the Vermont legislature were idiots, but because they did not believe they should have to make a law for something that should be self-evident. We don't pay staff to have sex with inmates. And yet, clearly we had to make a law that said if you are a staff person, there is never consent. So what are we talking about? Contact, again, between penis and vulva, penis and the anus, contact by mouth and any body part with the intent to abuse, arouse, or gratify sexual desire, penetration, contact intended to abuse, arouse, or gratify sexual desire, display of genitals, buttocks, and breasts in the presence of an inmate, and voyeurism. So the Congress really created a very specific set of definitions to look at. What's sexual harassment? Now again, I'm going to ask you something to consider. When I started in corrections, racial epithets were alive and well. And I'm glad and happy to report, for the most part, in most jails and prisons in these United States, we no longer tolerate racial epithets. I'm going to ask you the following. Do we tolerate comments about persons who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgendered? Is that not common parlance in many environments? I would submit to you that it still is. And that does constitute sexual harassment. What is that? Repeated and unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, verbal comments, gestures, or actions of a derogatory or offensive nature to an inmate, detainee, or resident by a staff member, contractor, or volunteer, demeaning references to gender, sexually suggestive or derogatory comments about body or clothing, or obscene language and gestures. And again, if you look at your own environments, I would submit to you that sexual harassment does occur, and that's something now that we have to really pay attention to. I'm going to turn it over to Linda to look at what does sexual abuse in detention look like.
So we're going to go through, to illustrate this, some of the statistics that we have recently learned over the past several years. As Bob mentioned earlier, there was the National Prison Rape Elimination Commission, and one of the things that they were directed to do was to study the issue. And they did that in conjunction with the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and PREA mandated that there be studies into prevalence. And you may all be familiar with this already, but the BJS has since 2008 been collecting data, 2007, 2008, been collecting data throughout the U.S. They have done 3 years of data collection in adult prisons and jails, going to a minimum of 10% of the prisons and jails in the U.S. And similarly, they have done 2 years of data collection in youth facilities. They have also collected all of the official reports and allegations from all of the adult facilities in the U.S. And more recently, they did a survey of former inmates, adult inmates who had been released from prison, so parolees essentially, and asked them about their experiences at any time during their most recent period of incarceration. So when we're providing these statistics throughout this presentation, they, for the most part, all come from those studies. We cite the direct ones, but just so you know, they're all available at the BJS website. Links to them are available at both Just Detention International's website and at the PREA Resource Center website if anyone wants to read them directly. And in the studies, for those of you who haven't seen them, they pull out the highlights, which is actually very quick and interesting reading, but then they also list line by line all of the facilities they actually went to. And in those studies, they sent in a team of interviewers, and they used a computerized system where the inmates had a laptop in front of them that had touch screens. They also had the audio in their ears so that they could get to a variety of different learning styles and communication styles. And they were completely anonymous. And some of you were any of you in facilities where those were done? Is that, yeah, okay. So they sort of bring in a team, they take over the place for a few days, and they randomly select people. So that's where those come from. The study of former inmates, 1 in 10 former inmates stated that they had been sexually abused at some time during their most recent period of incarceration, and that could have included a lockup, a jail, or a prison, or a community confinement facility. In terms of the other studies, what they found is in a 12-month period, when asked an adult in a prison, state or federal prison, have you experienced sexual abuse of any kind in the last 12 months? And they asked it in many different ways. They've consistently, over the 3-year period, come up with a prevalence rate of around 4%, between 4 and 4.5%, depending on the year. And for jails, around 3%, 3 to 3.2%. And we now have 3 years of data for adults, and that prevalence rate has stayed consistent over those 3 years. Also consistently in those studies, what they have shown again and again is nearly equivalent rates of abuse by staff and by inmates. Nearly even, okay? That's in the adult facilities as well. One of the things that we knew anecdotally previously, you heard Troy's story earlier on in the video talking about he was sexually abused at 12 almost immediately, and then it happened again and again. And in both adult and youth facilities, what we hear again and again is once someone is sexually abused, they're likely to be abused again, and the research has consistently backed that up. Part of that is they're still in the environment where it happened, right? There's ongoing contact with the perpetrator, potentially. Also, what we see sort of sociologically is the environment changes around the survivor, particularly if the facility doesn't have a very good response. If the person isn't treated well, if they're not protected, if it's not investigated thoroughly, if the perpetrators are not held accountable, then what that says is this person is a likely target. We can get away with it, which is what essentially perpetrators of sexual abuse want to do. In the youth report, 1 in 10 youth in juvenile facilities reported being sexually abused while in detention. This is from the most recent study. This is actually down from the previous one to a significant amount. For youth, the number who said they were abused more than once was even higher than for adults. So for youth, 70% said once they were abused again, more than once, and by more than one person. Again, in the youth facilities, even higher than the adults, 3 times more likely to be abused by staff than by other youth. So in the youth facilities, the staff abuse is beyond alarming. Something I do not need to tell this group is that prisons, jails, youth facilities have become the default mental health providers for all of our communities. And again, the research, they asked about this in the study to look at who is in prison and what are the dynamics. And again, the people who are in prison and jails are much more likely than the general population to have some kind of serious mental illness. As Bob mentioned, another piece of this is that people who have been victimized even before they were in prison or jail are more likely to be harmed again, particularly for women prisoners. We know this, and anecdotally, I hear from male prisoners as well that they seem to be more likely to have been abused previously, sexually or child abuse. We don't have the same kind of studies to back that up. There's some, but it's not, there haven't been as many. But for women prisoners are twice as likely to be survivors of previous sexual or domestic violence or child abuse than the general population. And when I did a counseling program in a men's prison for about a year, I helped with a pilot. We'll talk about that program later, but we offered counseling services to people whether they had been abused in the facility or previously. And over the year period, consistently, about half of my caseload had been sexually abused or harassed in the prison, and about half had been sexually abused or harassed when they were boys or teenagers or young men previously. One of the things that when we're talking with corrections, when we're working together with partners to help them implement, is they say, you talk about these prevalence rates, throw around these statistics. That's not what we're hearing. That's not happening here. And to understand that sexual abuse is one of the most underreported crimes. It is one of the most underreported crimes in the community. I see nods. I don't need to convert this group to that thought. But one of the things that the Bureau of Justice Statistics did in the study of former prisoners, because again, thinking they're out, we can ask them some more detailed questions about some of this because they're safer to talk, right? When they said, okay, if this happened to you, did you report it? For those who said, no, I did not report it, they asked, well, why not? And what they came up with was that 69% said they felt embarrassed or ashamed, and 70% said they simply didn't want anyone to know, which I think that if you talk to survivors who are not incarcerated, those are the same answers they would give, generally, very generally, as to why they did not report. We don't want people to know this happened. It feels shameful, it's very personal, and it's embarrassing, frankly. If most of us don't share our most recent sexual experiences with people that are not our very dearest friends or family, yet we expect people to report those. And hopefully for most of us, our most recent sexual experience was something that was wanted and pleasurable and isn't filled with shame and pain. So add those layers, and it's very understandable why a person would not tell. Some of the other things that are perhaps slightly more particular to a corrections environment is over half said they were currently afraid of the perpetrator at the time and didn't feel safe to tell because of that. And over 40% just thought, well, staff aren't going to do anything. They're not going to investigate anyway, so why should I put myself out there, potentially give myself more potential for danger when nothing's going to happen anyway. And over 40% also were afraid of being punished by staff. And the things that came up there were afraid of being punished by being placed in administrative segregation or secure housing units or isolation in other ways, and not simply for, a little while the investigation is started, but for longer term. And also for being written up for sexual misconduct, even though they were the ones that were being assaulted. Looking at the actual official reports and what happened, we see that those fears that prisoners had, that survivors had, were quite realistic, right? In 46% of the cases of staff abuse, the victim was actually written up for sexual misconduct with the staff. I did a training in a place I won't mention the other day, and when we brought up in the standards that it's clear that you cannot discipline an inmate for sexual activity with a staff member, right? That's in the standards, that it's staff misconduct. You could discipline the inmate for other things surrounding it, but not for the sexual misconduct. This was something that was, I would say, moved the earth for the people in this room. It was shocking, the level of distress that it caused them. And it was clear that, yes, they were, and in policy, and wanted to continue to write up inmates for sexual activity with staff. So again, think about the reporting rates, right? If someone is going to report and they have a realistic fear that they're going to be written up, they're not going to report. It was much higher in staff cases. In inmate cases, it was still nearly a third. Being moved to solitary confinement, if it was staff abuse, 41%, inmate abuse, 34%. One of the things, again, when I'm working with a facility, we always talk about, well, what are some other possibilities? What are some more trauma-informed responses? And I think, again, when we're doing work, one of the things we try to be clear about is PREA standards call for rethinking some default standard operating procedures. It doesn't say all the old standard operating procedures are bad, and it doesn't say that they're all wrong. What it says is that perhaps it's not always the way to go. So for example, moving someone to an isolated housing area might occasionally really be the only safe option, right? And that doesn't mean you should never use it, but it means it shouldn't be the default. It shouldn't be the only option without question, which I think from the places that I've done work with, it in the past has been. And simply no response at all for staff abuse. It was much lower, which is, I think I'm pleased to see that. But for inmate abuse, it was still 37% that they had no response at all. And in terms of a gender dynamic, it was something that I think is quite surprising to many of us, and we're still kind of need to look at this dynamic and what it means in terms of staff training and supervision and monitoring and such, is that first off, the majority of the abuse is cross-gender, which is not particularly surprising, perhaps, and why the standards have protections around, particularly in youth facilities, cross-gender viewing and pat searching, etc. So women, staff abusing male inmates or male youth boys, and female staff and male staff abusing girls and women. And that's, I think, a dynamic that wasn't necessarily expected, was that the high rates of women staff members who were implicated in abuse. Bob is going to talk a little bit more about the dynamics.
I want to try to put it in context, because what's interesting, first of all, what's old is new, what's new is old. I mentioned to you that I was with the Massachusetts Department of Youth Services and talked about Jerome Miller. In 1969, 1970, 1971, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts had training schools where there was rampant physical and sexual abuse by residents and staff. And one of the reasons that Jerome Miller, when he became Commissioner of the Department of Youth Services, came to the Commonwealth, he closed the training schools in part because this was a standard that was occurring back then. The other thing I want to put into context in terms of, how did these statistics, because when this was first discussed, a lot of people said, oh, it's really anecdotal. It really doesn't exist to the degree that you're talking about. This is something that you're blowing it out of proportion. Those of you that are familiar with criminal justice statistics, there's something called the Uniform Crime Reports. Those are official reports from police departments to the FBI about what occurs. The comparable experience in the corrections world is called the Survey of Sexual Violence. So basically, since 2004, state and correctional facilities, all departments of corrections, and a percentage of the jails have been officially reporting to the U.S. Department of Justice, specifically BJS, the official reports of sexual abuse in their facilities. Now, you would expect those to be what? The lowest percentage that exists, because we know most sexual crimes do not get reported. The comparable thing in terms of both the former inmates and in terms of, as Linda was referring to, the anonymous surveys using something called the audio CASI or audio computer assisted self-interview, that's equivalent to something called the National Crime Victimization Survey. What the federal government does is actually call general people in the community above the age of 12. They have anonymous surveys. And as you can expect, that number would be what? Traditionally much higher. So the actual number of sexual assaults that occur are somewhere between the official reports and the anonymous reports. Now, the question is, okay, who gets targeted? And to some degree, we know the answer to that. When someone wants to commit a crime, you want to get that crime done, and you want to do it with someone that's what? Not going to be believed, that nobody's going to take seriously, that someone's going to think that this is really some phenomena that's delusional. And so the people with mental illness, and you're going to see a little bit later, some of the statistics bear this out. People with mental illness are significant targets. For those of you that work with people with intellectual disabilities, or what we used to call mental retardation, what have we done with people, particularly in institutional care? We've trained them to be compliant. If they've been in institutional care, we've trained them to cooperate. So they become what? They actually will cooperate with their perpetrators because they think that that's what's necessary. Those with a history of trauma and sexual abuse, because they've already had that experience numerous times, and it creates an environment where they are more likely to be involved and actually more likely to be targeted as a result. We know this in terms of the mental health statistics. People who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgendered are at extraordinary risk for a whole host of reasons. And as we know from the mental health side, they also suffer a substantial amount of trauma, in addition with depression, suicidality, and so forth. And finally, people who are convicted of violent sexual offenses, because what? In the hierarchy of the jail or prison, someone that commits a sexual crime is someone that's considered, a person that's not to be, that person has our deepest contempt. Now, in terms of, and this is a study, and I apologize, we didn't have this is a study that was completed by Valerie Janess, the University of California in Irvine. In 2008, she actually interviewed in person every individual who was transgendered in the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. In 2012, she actually produced the study, and it said that people who are lesbian, bisexual, transgendered were 2 times more likely to have been sexually assaulted. And then again, 59% in California prisons, 59% of the transgender inmates reported sexual abuse, compared to 4% of the non-transgendered men. Now, is anyone surprised by that statistic? I mean, certainly we would know that, because that person is these individuals are at extraordinary risk. Now, in terms of mentally ill inmates, again, one of the most recent, the sexual victimization in prisons reported by inmates. So again, this is the anonymous survey that was just produced. This was for 2011 and 2012. In federal and state prisons, inmates with serious psychological distress are 9 times more likely to be sexually abused by another inmate than those with no indication of mental illness. Now, I also want to take you back, and we don't have a slide for this, but in the mid-1980s, a group of researchers went and took some films of individuals walking in Central Park. And what they did, the reason they did that is because they took those individuals in those films and they brought them to prison environments, and they asked prisoners themselves who were likely targets. What do you suppose the characteristics they found? It had nothing to do with race, it had nothing to do with height, it had nothing to do with gender, but what did it have to do with? How they carried themselves, how they looked, how they behaved, were they self-aware? And what do we know about people with serious persistent mental illness? If you're under the influence of a psychotropic drug, you're going to be compromised. You will look different, you will walk different, you will behave differently. And as a result, that puts you at enhanced victimization and possibility of victimization. In addition, survivors of previous sexual abuse, 1 in 12 jail inmates and 1 in 8 prisoners who have experienced prior sexual abuse and victimization reported sexual abuse by another inmate. Now, there's another reason for this, and some of you are aware of it. As I mentioned to you earlier, I had the opportunity to work in a district attorney's office where I work with community rape survivors in the community. One of the differences between working in a jail or prison or working in the community, with the exception of those people who had been the victims of child sexual abuse, or those individuals who have been kidnapped, most community sexual assault victims have one experience which changes their lives. What's different about being in jail or prison? you could see your perpetrator every single day. And especially if you don't tell anybody, and if that perpetrator is a staff or is another inmate, you could be abused multiple times. And we know, the data suggests, not only suggests, it actually informs us, that people who are in jails or prisons have actually multiple victimizations over multiple periods of time by multiple individuals. And one of the other reasons, and for those of you that work in corrections, are there any secrets in prison? There were no secrets in prison. If someone's been turned out, if someone's been targeted, if someone has been identified as having been sexually assaulted, lots of people are going to know. And if that person's been victimized by one person, other target and other perpetrators are going to take advantage of that person as well. The basics of sexual trauma is going to be Linda.
Again, we don't want to go into a lot of things that you all already know, so we're going to try to look at this from a specific angle of how does PREA look at it. And I think one of the things that, as a longtime sexual assault advocate, I was very gratified to see is that the standards really do have a trauma-informed approach. As Bob mentioned earlier, looking at overall philosophy, what is your policy, how do you put it in practice, and making sure that the impact of trauma, not only on the individual but on the entire environment, is considered in each step. And the standards in terms of including a coordinated response, a team approach, outside advocates, considering the survivor victim's level of comfort, own feelings about their previous possible future danger, which Bob will go into more later, really does take into account what is the impact of trauma. So a sexual trauma can be caused by any unwanted sexual behavior at all. And again, it's important that the standards define layers of behavior, including sexual harassment. I think working in the community even, and also with survivors who are incarcerated, would often hear survivors minimize what happened to them by saying, well, I wasn't raped, I was battered, or I was forced to give oral sex. And yet then having trouble accepting or really allowing themselves to have the full trauma reaction that they were actually having. What is wrong with me? All that happened was I had to give oral sex. I wasn't raped. I know someone who was raped. That's much worse. And understanding that, and as you all know, the impact of trauma has very little to do with what actually happened, and it has a lot more to do with how it impacts that individual person. Sexual abuse itself is one of the most traumatic forms of criminal victimization because of the very personal impact of it. If someone is hit by a car, they're not very likely to blame themselves for that, right? Whereas survivors of sexual abuse almost always blame themselves. In fact, in 25 years of working with survivors of sexual abuse, I've never met one who didn't blame themselves, regardless of the circumstances. So not only did this thing change my life, affect my core sense of self of who I am, but it was my fault. If I hadn't done this, if I hadn't done that. And certainly for survivors who are incarcerated, if I had not been arrested in the first place, right? As a counselor, as an advocate, when we look at sexual abuse and harassment, sexual abuse and detention, we look at sexual harassment. I'm going to skip protective pairing for a second. Sexual exploitation, we hear a lot about that. Getting someone into debt, forcing someone to put on some kind of shows, or this will happen to you. General sexual battery, touching, groping, grabbing. Abuse during searches is something that we hear a lot about in the letters we receive from survivors. We get about 75 letters a week from survivors of sexual abuse from all over the country, most of whom are still incarcerated, who are looking for some kind of help. The majority of the time, they're not actually looking for any kind of specific help from us. They just want someone to know. And they write a letter just telling their story and say, thank you, and you can share this if you'd like. And a lot of the examples we use come from those letters. And one of the things we're hearing more and more about is abuse during the searches. And a lot of what that looks like is comments about body parts during the search. crude comments, sexualized comments during the search. Certainly, it also looks like grabbing a breast, groping, lingering too long, fingers where they shouldn't be, essentially. And what I think it's very hard for staff, because it's very, and understandably so, it's very concerning for staff if I'm just doing my job and I could be accused of sexual abuse. And it is a real challenging issue. I don't want to minimize it. But in many of the survivors that I've spoken to, they've said, look, I get searched 20 to 25 times a day. I know the difference between a professional search and an unprofessional search. I can tell the difference. I've had hundreds of thousands of searches that were not problematic, and this one that was. We hear a lot about gang and rituals being used in pulling someone in, gangs using initiation rites or kicking someone out of a gang and using sexual abuse in that. More in adult facilities, but increasingly in youth facilities. Domestic violence and battering, abuse within relationships that perhaps started as willing within the facility, and then of course rape. Protective pairing, does everyone know what I mean by that? I see lots of nods. So pulling someone in, I will protect you if you do this for me. And really the dynamics look a lot like domestic violence in the community, in that the person who has the more power sets all the rules. They decide if someone can leave the relationship or not. They can do whatever they want, but you can't. Here's the rules. And we often hear things even about one inmate doing an inmate's laundry, cleaning their cell, etc., as a part of that. And then I'll protect you if you do all this for me. The common effects of sexual abuse in detention are the common effects of sexual abuse anywhere, with the addition of the daily stressors of being incarcerated. So acute stress disorder and PTSD, of course, sexually transmitted diseases and HIV. Sexually transmitted diseases and HRV are higher among the prison and jail population. I'm sure you all know that. They're also higher for survivors of sexual assault. So when you talk about sexual assault survivors in detention, you have a real risk for future medical issues. Same with suicidal thoughts or attempts. Survivors of sexual violence anywhere, wherever they live, are much more likely to have suicidal ideations and attempts, and people who are incarcerated have higher rates. People who are in administrative segregation settings, again, and I'm sure you all know this, have much higher rates of suicidal ideations and attempts. And remember again, what for many years has always been the default. I say I was sexually abused, you put me in ADSEG. And so then you're really talking about kind of a perfect storm for suicidality. Again, why the PREA standards include mental health evaluations as such an important response to sexual abuse. We've already talked at length about how many people with mental illnesses are inside prisons and jails and how likely they are to be targeted for sexual abuse. In the most recent study, they actually came out as the highest risk group. If someone already has a mental illness and they experience a major trauma, what happens to their symptoms? You can expect decompensation, right? You can expect any symptom they had to become much worse. And that in and of itself is a warning sign that it's really important for you all to let the staff in your facilities know about. One of the things in the rape crisis movement that is, of course, where in this field I grew up, we talk about that rape trauma syndrome, as it was first called by a couple of nurses, Burgess and Holmstrom in 1973, is essentially a reasonable reaction to an unreasonable amount of stress. It's the reaction that any person would have when they've been sexually assaulted. And that includes difficulty concentrating, hypervigilance or exaggerated startle response, of course sleep disturbances, either too much or too little, racing and intrusive thoughts, and being unable to get the thoughts, the memories about the assault, memories about self-doubt about if I had done this differently, it wouldn't have happened. Flashbacks, of course, increased irritability and anger, depression, and suicide again. So looking at particularly difficulty concentrating, an exaggerated startle response, and increased irritability and anger, think about for someone who's in a secure, structured setting where following the rules is paramount, where following the program is important, where you can be in trouble, get written up, a situation can escalate if you can't do that, if you're unable to concentrate, if you're startled by everything, and if you're irritable and angry at the drop of a hat, how likely it is for a recent survivor of sexual assault to end up getting in more trouble. And we hear that all the time. Not only in order to get to another unit. You heard Troy saying earlier that he started cutting on himself. And part of that was an adolescent response to trauma, right? The physical pain hurts less than the emotional pain. That it's quite expected for adolescents who are survivors of sexual abuse. But for Troy, it was also a conscious effort to get out of there, right? He knew that that was one of the ways he could escape. So thinking about those combinations of dynamics and how that works in a detention setting, we'll talk about that more in a moment. The basics of trauma is it's an event that's life-changing. Survivors I've worked with over the years describe this as a thing by which they mark time. This was me before the abuse, this is me after the abuse. They're two different selves, right? And this is how I count how my life has gone. You all know this, the essence is that it is or is perceived to be a near-death experience. And this is one of the important things for staff to understand is that, again, even if it wasn't literally a near-death experience, if the brain, if the body perceives it that way, then you're going to have that reaction and that complete sense of a loss of control. Again, thinking about incarcerated survivors, as a rape crisis counselor, one of the things that we do is try to help survivors regain control of their lives in little ways sometimes at first. Turn on a nightlight if you're feeling scared of the dark. Who cares if you're 45 years old? It doesn't matter. You don't have anything to prove, right? What can you do to get your life back? Whereas, of course, in a detention setting, that's quite difficult, right? The whole experience is a loss of control. And so when someone is assaulted, that really can exacerbate it. And it's a challenge for mental health professionals who are working with sexual assault survivors to help them heal, to help them find small ways to gain back some control. The essence of a traumatic event is that it takes someone who perhaps had some coping skills before, and again, many of the populations that you work with don't have very good coping skills to begin with, right? That's part of why they're with you, and also many of them have mental illnesses and other previous traumas, but the event overwhelms how they coped even so. Creates a feeling of terror, makes them feel unsafe anywhere. I've never spoken to a sexual assault survivor who walked into a room expecting to be raped. Whenever the person walks into the room, they don't expect to be raped in that moment. There are some times if they're trapped and they can't get out, of course. But in general, what that does, it says, I thought I was safe now, and I wasn't. And so now the world changes around me and nothing is safe. If I thought I was safe then and I wasn't, I might not be safe now. And so that feeling of terror never goes away. And in that moment and ongoing triggers that fight, flight, or freeze reaction, right? And so there's constant bursts of adrenaline, right? There's constant feelings of dissociation if the person is freezing. And all of these things are keeping the person at a level of intensity that's really difficult to deal with on a daily basis. And yet, of course, I say this, and that it can affect everybody differently. Some people just numb out and seem like nothing happened. Some people are actually able to put it away in their subconscious in such a way that they don't even remember it for years. And I'm sure you've all seen that. The way that traumatic memories are stored, right, they're stored in the base part of the brain, in the amygdala, that does not sort for time and space. So trauma memories are not logical. They're not thought through. And what that means is that two things that are really particular for corrections, for law enforcement context, is that in the moment, first off, a survivor's reactions to new events, to crises and fear, and their ability to handle that are changed. So I am living in a constant state of feeling in danger. And if someone burst in the back of the room, I would not be able to process that that is far away, that it's probably nothing, that we could just stop and say, I'm sorry, can we help you? I would feel threatened and danger and react with that fight, flight, or freeze reaction. That's what the trauma being in the brain does. Another part of what it does is that trauma memories are stored in a different way than other sorts of memories. And they're not stored in a linear way, they're not stored in a logical way, and they're not stored in a who, what, when, where, why, just the facts, ma'am kind of way. And again, the challenge for that in a law enforcement or corrections environment is that when something happens in our facilities, we want to know what happened so we can deal with it. And the survivor of sexual assault may not be able to recount it that way. Think of someone recounting a car accident. I heard a screech, I spun around, I was all of a sudden in a ditch, there was blood on my forehead. Wait a minute, I heard a siren beforehand, I was coming from the store. Does that sound like a way someone might recount a car accident? A sexual assault would be in a similar way. And that's a real challenge for the staff, for the investigators that you all work with, when they need to know. I need to know what happened in order so I can make my report and I can keep everybody in the facility safe. And again, from your perspective, helping your staff and the facility staff that they work with understand that, particularly in those first three days immediately after a traumatic event, memories are not clear. They may remember very distinctly that there was a blue smudge on the wall, but not remember the hair color of the person who raped them, right? And that would be expected. We work with a prosecutor a lot who said, the sexual assault report that you want to be suspect of is not the one that has holes. The one that has holes is probably true. The one that has 0 holes, you might want to take a second look at. And I see nods, I don't need to belabor that point. So thinking of all of that, what are some of the impacts of incarceration on sexual assault survivors? If people could just call out, and I'll repeat it back, specifically in your environments, think about what would be particularly difficult or challenging for someone who's recently been sexually assaulted in functioning, in reporting, in healing, any of those things. Can you think of anything? Mm-hmm.
And not only institutional culture, but prisoner culture, and trying to heal a system that doesn't really allow for that.
Yes. Yes.
There are so many obstacles, but particularly to people who are incarcerated
For right.
periods of time and from a young age.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So what she said is that for people who are incarcerated for life or for a very long time, and they're subject to the environment, the prisoner culture, the staff culture, the institutional culture, that doesn't really allow for time and space to recover, for downtime, for healing work, for being emotional, that it's particularly hard to move through that healing. And absolutely, I think one of the things I saw in starting this work, coming from the community to here in 2005, was that, wow, the survivors really seem to get stuck, many of them at a base level of what I would call the middle phase of healing, the outward adjustment where they're functioning, maybe they're not having flashbacks all the time, but really not moving to that integration or acceptance phase because of that. Difficulty escaping their abuser, absolutely, so that proximity to the abuser. Fear of repeated trauma, right, they know too, the statistics, right? They don't need to hear the numbers, they know they're at greater risk, absolutely. They're expected to be counseled by a mental health professional who is an employee of the very institution or facility that didn't keep them safe or didn't protect them. I really want to repeat that point there, because again, he's saying his experience with having clients who were sexually exploited by staff members, and that one of the biggest problems was the staff's reaction to the behaviors that were a trauma reaction, essentially. And so then that person ended up long-term in isolation as a result of what was an expected trauma reaction, which of course only made it worse. So they can't escape and don't have a lot of resources or methods for coping available to them. And so sometimes it might seem even more sensible or easier to yield as opposed to report or try to fight back in any way. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you. And I think, as Bob mentioned earlier, pat searches, strip searches, for someone who's been sexually assaulted, that unwanted touching of their body, even if it's done very professionally, is traumatizing. And just, it's maybe not something we can do anything about, but I think just a dynamic to remember, as well as the just unpredictability of the environment. Right. All right. Bob. Bob's up.
One of the things we wanted to try to do also is to give you some specific standards to pay attention to. What I would like to just focus on, again, in terms of the mental health services, and I think this is particularly relevant for all of us, less than 10% of the persons who identified themselves as having been victims of sexual assault while incarcerated actually saw a therapist or a counselor. Now, it's unclear as to whether it's because they did not feel comfortable, or they were guilty or ashamed, or because they did not have faith or trust that the system would respond appropriately. Less than 10% enrolled in a self-help group for emotional and mental health problems, and only 5% enrolled in treatment program other than counseling. Now, one of the things that we know, if someone has an extraordinarily traumatizing experience and they don't get counseling, are they going to be at further exacerbation of their trauma symptoms? And it's something we certainly understand. Now, what we want to do is kind of give you an opportunity. Now, the other thing, let me just for the record, people say, well, what about the PowerPoints? We have a lot of information there. This is very deep. As I understand it, these PowerPoints will be available in a couple of weeks. I encourage all of you, if you have not yet done so, please download the actual PREA standards as promulgated by the Department of Justice, and please also get a copy of the audit, basically compliance indicators, which have just recently been promulgated, because that's really important, because that's what all of us are going to be held accountable for. So I want to bring your attention to some standards that you need to pay attention to. Number one, medical and mental health screenings, the history of sexual abuse. Now, I think most of you should be familiar with this. If the screening pursuant to 115.341 indicates that the prison inmate or juvenile resident has been previously perpetrated sexual abuse, staff shall ensure that inmate resident is offered a follow-up meeting with the mental health practitioner within 14 days of the intake screening. So that's, again, something that you need to pay attention to. Mental health screenings, again, if the screening pursuant to this standard indicates that a prison, jail inmate, or juvenile resident experienced prior sexual victimization, shall offer and ensure that the inmate resident is offered a follow-up meeting with medical and mental health practitioner within 14 days. In terms of that, again, that same standard, 115.81, limit the information related to sexual victimization and abusiveness in an institutional setting to medical and mental health practitioners. Can share with other staff as necessary to inform treatment plans and security and management decisions, but you must obtain informed consent prior to disclosing abuse that did not occur in the institution. Now, this is a substantial difference from what most of you have maybe been involved with. Most of us have given the standard colloquy. Everything you tell me is confidential, except you can tell me you're going to abuse and neglect a child and elderly person. You tell me about being a risk of harm to self, harm to others. But we're now saying, if you say and you identify that you've been sexually victimized in an institutional setting, we as staff people have a duty to report. However, for any victimization that occurred outside of the institution, like anything else, we have to get informed consent. Medical and mental health practitioners can obtain informed consent before reporting information about prior sexual victimization that did not occur in an institutional setting, obviously unless that occurred when they were under the age of 18, because we are all mandatory reporters. This does not apply to lockups or community confinement facilities, so I mentioned to you that, again, the standards were specifically crafted to look at the differences in institutional settings. If 115.21 looks at the evidence, protocol, and forensic medical examination, agencies must use a uniform evidence protocol to maximize evidence collection. There is actually a national set of standards which has actually been repromulgated and improved. But I also caution you, every one of your facilities and states has its own specific requirements. For example, in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, all the individual sexual assault evidence collection kits must be done with a specific format that's been approved by the Attorney General in our Commonwealth state. So you need to become familiar with the environment in which you work with. For those of you that are responsible for those kind of things, please make sure you make note of that. Also, allow access to forensic medical exams on-site or an outside facility at no cost. And attempt to make available an advocate from a rape crisis center for accompaniment and emotional support. Now, again, that's another big difference that most of us are not familiar with. Traditionally, we have been what? We sort of handle everything amongst ourselves. We're now saying, and this is important because this is an attempt to create parity with the community. In the community, if you are a victim of sexual assault, you can get a rape crisis advocate to accompany you to the hospital to actually participate in assisting you through that process. We're now providing the same opportunity for a victim who is incarcerated as any person in the community. Inmate access to outside confidential support services. Again, access to outside victim advocates for emotional support services related to sexual abuse. Reasonable communication between the inmates and the agencies in as confidential a manner as possible. The agency must inform the inmates the extent to which communications are monitored, and also entering into memorandum of understanding. Now, what's interesting about this, many of us in an institutional setting may or may not be familiar with the community resources that exist. So again, I encourage you to reach out to your local rape crisis center. Again, most states have a unified agency for, again, in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, there's something called Jane Doe, and they actually monitor all the agencies that are under the supervision of providing rape crisis services. But that's something you're going to work also with your institutional environment as well as your departments to enter into those memorandum of understanding. Access to emergency medical and mental health services. Again, you must provide emergency medical treatment and crisis intervention, information and access to the emergency room, and also a contraception and sexually transmitted infection prophylaxis. Services must be at no cost, regardless of naming the abuser or participating in investigations. So this is important. Now, this also has several components to it. You do not, as a victim, have to necessarily cooperate with an investigation to get services. And that's extremely important. And that's somewhat parity with the community. The difference between the community and incarceration, and I think most of you are aware of that, in the community, as a sexual assault victim, you can go to the hospital, get treatment, and you don't have to inform law enforcement. That's your choice as a victim. In jails or prison, we don't afford them the opportunity to do that because what? In jails or prisons, that person's under the supervision of the state or of the confinement institution. If we fail to provide for the services, we are culpable as the agency. So that's the difference, and that's one of the challenges. But at the same time, if you don't want to participate in an investigation, you still have the opportunity to get medical and mental health treatment. The other thing about this is that this is not a one-time shot thing, particularly with STI prophylaxis. There has to be scheduled follow-ups and according to the medical indications that are necessary. So that's something you have to make sure of. Ongoing medical and mental health care for sexual abuse victims and abusers. Now, most of us get the victim part. A lot of us are going to say, well, what do you mean? I now have to treat people who are abusing and perpetrating sexual abuse? Yes, we do. I mean, all of us in sexual assault in jails and prisons, we address and treat sexual offenders. I mean, there are many of the individuals who actually come under our supervision. If a person has a predilection to this, we do have a responsibility to create an environment where we're going to provide those services. So, medical and mental health evaluation and treatment for survivors. And again, the term survivors, all of you are familiar with that. A victim is when it first happens. Hopefully the goal is to go from being a victim to a survivor and then ultimately to a thriver. You know, I had been victimized, but I'm now going to manage this and now I'm going to move on with the rest of my life. That's sort of the language and the parlance of the rape crisis movement. Follow-up services, treatment plans, and referrals for community care. Again, depending on the institution or the agency you work with, that may or may not go well. You have to have the opportunity to, if that person's leaving your setting and moving to another setting in your agency, getting that information to the next agency. If that person's leaving your setting to the community, getting that person to the right referrals and treatment services that may exist in the community. Care consistent with the community standard. I mean, again, part of what we're doing is meeting the needs of that person as any other patient would be met in the community, and the care that we provide must be consistent with that. Ongoing medical and mental health care, again, for abuse, pregnancy tests, and lawful pregnancy-related services. So again, there is the responsibility, if someone has been impregnated as a result of this, in the community, most individuals would have the opportunity to have that managed. Testing and treatment for sexually transmitted infections at no cost, regardless of naming the abuser, and participating in investigation. Just as an aside, one of my mental health court clients in the community actually had received a $3,000 bill from the local community hospital because the police failed to inform that this person had been the victim of sexual assault. And we're now in the process of actually litigating it so that she doesn't have to become responsible for it. So the same approach is here. You, in the environments, if this person's a victim, the services should be free and at no cost. Again, all prisons shall attempt to conduct a mental health evaluation. of all known inmate and inmate abusers within 60 days of learning of such abuse history, and offer treatment when deemed appropriate by mental health practitioners. This standard, there's nothing in the standards that would prohibit telemedicine as an opportunity to meet this requirement. And certainly, again, I mean, like Texas, I mean, there are a lot of environments where it just does not lend itself to that. So to the best of my knowledge, I think telemedicine services would be meeting that standard as long as that's available to that person. Yes, sir. And that's a good question. The question was, can you use the technology of telemedicine for your rape crisis advocate? I am assuming that should be available and maybe an opportunity. I'm not sure, however, that all available services, and Linda may have some further insight into
I
that.
actually just wanted to add, and your question is very timely, the Office on Violence Against Women is one of the federal agencies under the Department of Justice that funds a lot of the rape crisis programs throughout the U.S. They recently put out a request for proposals for telemedicine and rape crisis services, including a forensic nurse component for places where there is absolutely nothing available. So they only got 2 applications. They didn't. So look for that on the Office of Violence Against Women site. They'll be putting it out again, and it would be really interesting to see how that works.
It's an excellent question, because I think, again, all of us are strapped for resources, and depending upon what your environment is, you may or may not have those resources available in the community that you happen to reside in or where the institution is serving. There are other relevant standards that I think you need to be aware of. One is 115.16, inmates with disabilities and inmates who are limited English proficient. Now, obviously, we as medical and mental health people won't be dealing with the limited English proficiency, but we will be dealing with individuals who have a mental illness, who have an intellectual disability, who have a cognitive disorder, who have a neurological disorder, any of those things which could affect communication and understanding. That is within our purview, and that's something that we should be paying attention to. Screening for risk of victimization and abusiveness. Again, are there predictable indicia of a person who may be at risk of victimization? And the answer is yes. So clearly the agency and the institution must begin to look at it. And what do you already know? If someone's got a serious persistent mental illness, is that person at risk of victimization? Absolutely. If someone is self-identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, is that person at increased victimization? Absolutely. I mean, there are a number of clear indicia you should be aware of. And then inmate reporting. We must create a reporting culture. I mean, part of what this whole process is about, you saw the statistics, and I don't think any of you were surprised at. If inmates feel that we're not going to be taken seriously, that no one's going to pay attention or protect me if I come forward, then why come forward? In addition, if I don't come forward and get the help I need, that's going to put me at risk. If you have these standards, if you have these problems, what do you do with those inmates? Okay, well, I think, again, every institution should have a mechanism, either through your reception and classification process or the initial intake, to identify people who have a serious persistent mental illness, who have a cognitive disability or an intellectual disability. I mean, that, again, when I was with the Commonwealth, I served at the Reception and Classification Center at MCI Concord. Our initial duty as a mental health practitioner was to actually identify those people and then inform the institution and then create the proper support services as they move through the environment. Now, that can be more difficult than a jail, but I'm assuming most state departments should have that vehicle pretty much covered, and maybe incorrect. When the auditors come to our facility, we're going to be examined under these set of standards. And if, for example, the current mechanisms that you have at your agency do not meet that, then it's going to be part of our collective responsibility, and certainly you as a medical or mental health person should be part of that discussion with your agency. There are a couple of other relevant standards you should be paying attention to. One is agency protection against retaliation, and I think particularly mental health people are important here. If someone has been victimized and being sexual abuse either by another inmate or by a staff person, there's also a duty to protect that person from being further retaliated against either by staff or inmates. Reporting to inmates, in terms of what does that mean? If you're the victim of a crime in the community, do you get information about what's happening to the perpetrator? Yes. That same approach is for victims in an incarcerated setting. If you've reported this person committed this crime against me, there is a responsibility on the part of the agency to get back to that inmate and report what is in fact going on. Is this person been brought to the grand jury? Is this case pending before the court? Was there a disposition? Sexual abuse incident reviews. One of the things that is now happening, if an incident occurs, similar to those of you that have been through a suicide autopsy or an after-action review, the same approach will be for people who have been sexually assaulted. when it occurs, medical and mental health, in addition with security, administration, classification, will be called to the table to review. Was this predictable? Could have this been known? Could have this been prevented? Was this an error in policy? Was this an error in terms of staff? So that process will be there. And finally, interventions and disciplinary sanctions for inmates. As you saw from some of the data that have been reported, if you come forward and say that you've been sexually abused, should you be punished for that abuse? And I think it's ridiculous. Okay, if I've been the victim of staff sexual misconduct and I get a disciplinary report for having contact with the staff, I'm the victim, and you're going to discipline me for that? So clearly there's some standards you need to pay attention to. Coordinated response, you should have a written institutional plan. And here again, if you have not been part of this discussion, please get to your agency administrator or to your central office and become part of that, because there should be an institutional plan to coordinate the actions among staff first responders, medical and mental health practitioners, investigators, facility leadership. Everyone should know what his responsibilities are, what each individual will do in the event of something that happens. The written plan should include immediate steps when an inmate's at risk, policy to protect the person from retaliation, agreements with community service providers, and incident reviews. Again, first responders, and this is from the standards, must separate victims from suspects. Now again, that's generally a custody case, but when a victim has come forward, will they be brought to the HSU or the medical unit? Yes, they will, so you need to be aware of that. Preserve the crime scene, request that the victim not take any action that could destroy the evidence, and disclose information on a need-to-know basis. Prison and jails are also, we also mentioned this, provide access to rape crisis services in a confidential manner, work with community agreements with providers, and provide consistent community standard of care. On the left, actually, this is Linda and I had the opportunity to do some work at the California Department of Corrections at CC Height Tehachapi. Just to let you know that program has been in place since 2005, and the facility was design capacity is 2,900 and 5,900 inmates. Despite that, they had an excellent rapport and an excellent opportunity to do this. Okay, we're going to.
I think we'll just take questions now. So we have available, and this is something I'm more than happy to answer any individual questions people have about the coordinated response. Just Detention International has worked to test out how does this actually work. That's one of the things that we do. We've taken, since PREA was passed, even in 2003, taken either the intent or once there were draft standards available, bits of it, and looked at how is this going to work on the ground? Does this actually work? And test it out in places that are willing to work with us. Bob already talked about what rape crisis centers are, so I won't go through that now, but what we've done is create teams within several different corrections agencies, and we've done this across the country. The two places that we've done it that are the most established are in the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, where, as Bob mentioned, we've had programs since 2005. Among those programs is an individual, face-to-face, 100% confidential, just like community rape crisis counselors counseling program. Of course, a woman in the back mentioned earlier that one of the problems is that victims of sexual assault are expected to work with mental health providers who are also representatives of the facility, often don't have confidentiality around many things. And so we wanted to try this out. Custody staff were at first alarmed at the idea that there would be outsiders coming in doing counseling and having confidentiality except in the cases of harm to self or others or child abuse. But I want to say that it has never once been questioned since it started. And never once has it even been considered removing it or changing that confidentiality agreement, because it has worked. And I'm happy. And the other place where we have pretty established programs is in the Miami-Dade Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. They're a county jail system. That's a separate department. They're not a part of a sheriff's department. And we've done a lot of work along the way to test out some of the coordinated response piece, particularly, as well as inmate education. So happy to answer questions about that. But instead of going into the plan we had, I thought it would make more sense to spend the last couple of minutes with any questions or comments. And I know you had one in the back. And so the question was, if someone reports, this happened to me, I was sexually assaulted, name a time frame. What is the time frame when a forensic exam should still be done? And you're saying that the guidance you heard was 96 hours, and that if it was a week out, the rest should be, the rest of the responses should be the same. So the PREA standards mention the frame 96 hours in the standards. The reason for that is that many states and forensic associations, the International Association of Forensic Nurses, looks at 96 hours as the time frame, the minimum time frame at which you should still sort of without question do a forensic exam. It used to be 72. In some states it still is. In some states it's now 120. So what I would say is that you should look at each of your own jurisdictions and state guidelines. And in terms of the projects we've worked on, I would say, and I know the PRC generally would agree with this, we've talked about this, that while the standards mention 96 hours, best practice is for medical and mental health staff to be part of a team approach, that coordinated approach, that if someone says, I was raped a week ago, that the answer is not necessarily a default, no, we're not going to do an exam. What if there's injuries? What if the person managed to save some DNA evidence somewhere? There may still be very good reason to do a forensic exam, but I would think that your medical staff shouldn't be held responsible for making that decision if they don't have forensic training, but that the best practice would be to build that relationship with the forensic examiner in your community so that you can call them and say, look, a week ago, this person was choked and raped. There's still fingerprint bruises on the throat, and they say they saved a hanky with DNA evidence on it. What should we do? And ask them. Does that make sense? Yeah. Who does the forensic exams? Great question. So again, the standards mention and best practice is that a qualified sexual assault forensic examiner, sexual assault nurse examiner are the two phrases that are used, sane or safe, who is a certified examiner who works in the community in best practice. And whether or not you take people out to a community hospital, there's in many jurisdictions, I would say most jurisdictions across the country, there are certified sexual assault exam sites. The gentleman mentioned over here, in some counties, communities, there are not, and that's true. In that case, there might be a mobile team that goes from hospital to hospital, or there might be a doctor in the ER who has some forensic training. So in your own counties, I would look to where is that person available. It is not, and I know this is a conflict of interest for medical staff within corrections, it's also a training issue. It's not best practice, and you are not required under the standards by any means for your medical staff to be doing forensic exams. Can you create MOUs or contractual agreements with outsiders to come in? And that is one of the things that we've been working on in California at one of the facilities where the nearest forensic exam site is about 90 miles away. There is a forensic examiner who has mobile equipment, and she has agreed that they will come in. I think the thing that's important to remember with that is not to forget the rape crisis advocate piece of the team, if that's your approach. The benefit of, if you can at all transport someone to the community hospital, is that then you will have the full response, including the rape crisis advocate, because usually they respond to whatever hospital. In this case, in our MOU, we're including the rape crisis advocate to come in as well. I know it was the end of the conference, so thank you so much.